It's finally here. After nearly 2 years of waiting since the game was initially announced, and a trailer showing us that investigative journalist Alyssa Ashcroft, one of the main playable characters from Resident Evil Outbreak, would be making a return to the series along with her daughter, a new character named Grace Ashcroft, who serves as one of the 2 playable characters within Resident Evil 9, was something I found to be quite interesting. Of course, the second playable character making a return to the franchise is everyone's fictional crush, Leon Kennedy, revealing him as an aged man who is infected with some kind of virus, and that his mission will somehow lead him back to a decaying Raccoon City for answers. Needless to say, I was both overjoyed and cautiously optimistic at the same time. On one hand, I think that bringing Leon back to the place that started this crazy journey for him is a fantastic way to bring everything full circle. However, my reasoning for the cautious optimism was out of concern that Capcom may only be bringing it back to bank on nostalgia and to do nothing creative with it other than to try and get players to point and say, "Hey, I remember that." When it comes to the character of Leon Kennedy, I'm very protective of him. Resident Evil 2 and the remake are some of my favorite Resident Evil games, as you all would know if you watched my video where I ranked every mainline Resident Evil game. The fact of the matter is that Resident Evil 9 would need to tread very carefully when it comes to handling the aftermath of Resident Evil 2. Now that the game is here and I've 100% completed it in its entirety, that's what we'll be here to discuss. I should state the obvious before we get into my analysis, that this video will be delving into massive spoilers for Resident Evil 9. I won't be leaving any stone unturned when it comes to its gameplay or narrative, as I want to cover every part of it thoroughly. So now's your chance to click off if you haven't already, and without any further delay, let's talk about Resident Evil 9, the good, the bad, and the amazing. The game starts by introducing us to Grace Ashcroft, an FBI technical analyst who has been investigating a mystery virus that has some kind of connection to both Raccoon City and the Wrenwood Hotel. The hotel that Alyssa Ashcroft, her mother, died inside of 8 years ago. While the director tells her that he's not forcing her to go, he admits that having her eyes on the scene could prove to be useful. Grace reluctantly agrees to go, which is when we are then given control to Grace and introduced to one of Resident Evil 9's new features, the ability to change your perspective in gameplay. In Resident Evil games, you're only ever given one fixed perspective to play the game through. With the early games, it was the fixed camera angles, later on it changed to a third-person perspective, and now more recently it has leaned into the first-person perspective. Resident Evil 9 lets you decide which perspective to switch between for both Leon and Grace. When I first saw that you would be able to interchange between the two, I was a little skeptical that the game might compromise one for the other, but I'm happy to report that you are able to play from whatever perspective you like. While it is recommended that you play in the first person as Grace and third person as Leon for better immersion and to make the tonal shifts more natural, it's nice to see Capcom making the game more accessible to newcomers if they aren't comfortable or simply don't like certain camera angles. Apart from that, I personally find this introductory sequence of Grace moving through the Wrenwood Hotel to be completely unnecessary, and should have been shown in the form of a cutscene as a continuation from the previous. It doesn't do a whole lot to add what the game has told us narratively, and the gameplay portions of Grace navigating her way through the hotel are mostly scripted events that not only ruin the flow by having so many occur in one sequence, but also damage the replay value when players are trying to get through this section in a rush. The most that we get from this from a narrative perspective is Grace finding the room that she and her mother stayed in the night she was killed, and getting a flashback to those events, where we see in intricate detail how she was killed. This flashback lasts nearly 10 minutes, and its main purpose is to tell us where a certain object was hidden in order for us to progress. It certainly wasn't used to communicate how Grace's mother died, because that information was already communicated to us from the start. Showing us that again is unnecessary, and using it as a way to convey where an item is ruins the pacing of this section. Once we get the item, we have an encounter with a zombie, and after we narrowly escape its attack is where we transition over to Leon. Something new that this game does, unlike in previous entries in the franchise, where you would have to pick a player's campaign and stick with that character for most of the game, Resident Evil 9 has you constantly switching over between the two throughout the course of the game. For the most part, this idea is executed fairly well, as Grace's sections are more focused on the survival horror aspects of the game, whereas Leon's are primarily action-oriented. Essentially, it's basically what Resident Evil 6 was trying to do all those years ago, and failed miserably at. I'd say that this game utilizes these parts of the game best during the parts where you're at the care center, as Leon's sections are short and sweet, and serve as a nice break for the player so you aren't too desensitized from the more horrific parts of Grace's campaign, and give the game a good sense of flow to it. I should also clarify that to make the video easier to follow along with when going section by section, I'll be dividing the Grace and Leon sections of the game into 2 parts. Although, before I start talking about Grace, I will say that they should have made Leon the first person you control as, since Leon was trying to go after Victor right after Grace narrowly survived her encounter with the zombie. It actually introduces the player to the core mechanics and gives us a feel of how Leon's part of the game will work. It doesn't waste our time, and is a nice bit of excitement before we switch over to Grace in the care center. I'll expand upon Leon's first section more later. I just wanted to give my thoughts on how the game could have paced its introductory sequence better. When it comes to Grace's gameplay, the developers show you just how contrasted her sections are in comparison to Leon's. She is incredibly inexperienced when it comes to combat encounters, and the game's level design reflects that throughout. Each area is crafted as a perfect obstacle to Grace, and at times it can be quite fun trying to work out how you'll navigate certain areas, as you start out at quite a disadvantage. You start off with no items with the exception of a glass bottle that you can use to distract your enemies. While you are given Leon's Magnum, there's only one bullet in the chamber, and you have to decide carefully which target you want to use that one bullet on. Something I found to be a little disappointing is that no matter what you do throughout Leon's section, Grace will always be given a singular bullet. This could have been the opportunity to give the player some consequences for going all gung-ho with Leon, as it actively leaves Grace at a disadvantage, and that conserving your ammo could help Grace in the long run. But that is unfortunately not the case. This is less of a criticism I have of the game, and more so just me citing a missed opportunity that the game could have done something similar to the original RE2 did with their zapping system. The care center itself is extremely creepy and atmospheric, with each room having its own unique personality. It's clear that there was a lot of thought and effort put into each room, whether that be the placement of certain items that force you to return later, or just its overall environment. It's all there to make you feel like you are right there with Grace when experiencing these horrors. It's no secret that there was some clear inspiration taken from the Spencer Mansion and the RPD, as it borrows a couple of key elements in its level design, most notably its almost non-linear approach to how you explore the care center as Grace. In order to escape the care center, you are required to get 3 quartz cubes to unlock the door that is keeping you from your freedom. This is where the non-linearity of the level design comes in, as there is really no order in which you can acquire them. You can do it however you want. On each replay of the game, I opted to grab every quartz cube differently from my last playthrough, and it led to some pretty interesting experiences. One of which is that you can actually miss a cutscene with Victor if you go about finding the quartz cubes in a different order. And that's what I would say is this game's greatest strength, how the care center is structured and designed. The layout of the care center is crafted so well that you'll be backtracking a lot as you explore, finding different secrets, shortcuts, and puzzles to unlock, with the added bonus of antique coins that have been spread out throughout the care center for you to be on the lookout for. Antique coins can be traded in for rewards in the parlor, giving the player some minor upgrades that can go a long way for you in the late game, like extra inventory space, better aim, more health, and an upgrade for your blood collector that allows you to steal more blood from your enemies. It's a neat little incentive that adds an extra layer to the level design, and I found it a fun way to upgrade your character so you can even the odds a little bit more. But not so much that you become an overpowered killing machine. The game understands how important balance is with Grace, and I think they do it just right with these mini upgrades you can collect. However, if I were to nitpick one thing about the care center's design, is that I kind of wish that both the west and east wings were open to you from the start. This can be designed in a way so that both wings have an area where you can get a handgun from, so it doesn't create an unbalanced experience. It would add a bit more to the almost non-linear experience that the game is trying to replicate with the Spencer Mansion and the RPD. It's not even like this would drastically change anything if they did commit to this idea, as you can still get all 3 quartz cubes in whatever fashion you desire. It only accentuates that feeling of player choice that they can go wherever they want to progress. This isn't that big of an issue, as you unlock the keycard that allows you to progress to the next area pretty soon anyway, but it's yet another missed opportunity I wish the developers had implemented into the game. A neat bit of level design I noticed throughout Grace's section in the daycare is how often the game forces you to confront the enemies, whether that be by moving past them or fighting your way through. The game will actively encourage you to put yourself in those positions if you either want to progress or get better rewards. For example, there is this enemy known as the Chef that you encounter as soon as you acquire the West Wing keycard, which you'll have to move past to progress. For a good chunk of the game, he serves as quite a foil to you as you try to navigate through the West Wing, as he can basically one-shot you if you end up getting caught in his grasp. However, there is a way to take him down, and with that comes many upsides to your experience. For instance, in order to get the level 2 wristband, you find 2 organs to revive the guy so you can take the upgraded wristband off of him. Now, if you haven't defeated the Chef by this point in the game, the Chef will be guarding one of those rooms, giving you a harder time getting one of the organs. But had you have killed him earlier, then he'll no longer be guarding the room, making it easier for Grace to get the item she needs. But that's not the only upside, as you're also given a key to the pantry in the Chef's kitchen when you've defeated him. That gives you lots of little goodies and upgrades that will aid Grace on her journey. It's that risk-reward system that makes the gameplay all the more satisfying when you play as her. Your first section is where you'll be encountering the main threat of Grace's section, called the Girl. Like many other enemies, the girl's weakness is her affliction to light. However, her reaction to light is more extreme in comparison to the other enemy types in this game. Whenever she is in the light, she starts to burn, causing her to scurry off back into the darkness. As you can imagine, a majority of the times you'll be encountering her is in the pitch black, as you have to find a way to retreat back into the light where she can't get you. The way this evolves throughout the game is quite a bit of fun, although I personally think her sections could be better. The first section you encounter her is at the very start of the game, when you awaken after Victor kidnaps you, and the only thing you have to defend yourself with is a glass bottle. Your main objective throughout this section is to unlock the door that leads to the care center. While I think this is a decent enough section that allows you to grow comfortable with how Grace's gameplay will contrast to Leon's, the girl is fairly easy to avoid on most difficulties. Her pathfinding may be random, but she is very easy to read, and doesn't have any unique abilities that get added onto her throughout the game. Her routine is usually chasing you and climbing onto the roof and maneuvering around from there. I'd say her section at the beginning is probably the most scripted, where she's given a little more freedom in the later sections, but I'm a little disappointed by the game's over-reliance on scripted events compared to more natural horror. The second section she appears in is a little bit better, where she gets to roam around a lot more. The game gets a little bit more creative with the different ways you can find to escape her. Instead of running into certain parts of the light that have been pre-lit by the game, you control what areas get powered up with the power plugs. While you can fire your ammo into her with your newly acquired weapons, causing her to run away if you lodge enough ammo into her. I wouldn't recommend this tactic unless you're desperate, as you're either going to waste ammo or risk a swift death when she's running towards you before you can even manage to stun her. The only time I found it useful to use my weapons against her was on my second playthrough when I had infinite ammo. Another added level of intensity is that zombies are now an additional threat to be on the lookout for when trying to evade the girl. It does a good job at building upon your first encounter with the girl by adding new obstacles. It feels like you are a mouse trapped in a maze throughout this section, as you are constantly trying to navigate the environment using the power plugs. At times they can be your undoing, because if you forget to bring one with you, you could end up getting trapped with the girl. It retains that claustrophobic nature while still being an open environment to go through as you're trying to figure out where all the power plugs go in each area, which creates quite a bit of fun and exploration. However, like the first encounter with the girl, the scripted parts really harm this section when going through it. Even the parts that don't involve her have their own little scripted segments, like in one area where in order to get one of the power plugs, you have to go through this monotonous meat grinder set piece that honestly lasts way too long. Usually these things get quite tiresome on a second playthrough, but even my first time playing, I found this segment to be arrogantly flagrant in its execution. There is not any skill to it, and it's pretty easy to cheese, as you just keep walking in a single direction for a couple minutes and you'll be fine. Worst case scenario is that you'll have to fire a bullet at a zombie if they get a little too close, but since they're on a moving conveyor belt, I'd say you'd be fine 90% of the time. Once you get all 3 of the required power plugs to save Emily from her imprisonment, you get a set piece where you have to quickly navigate your way back to the elevator, and I love how this set piece keeps escalating the danger throughout. At first you have to worry about the zombies in your general direction, but when you're finally in the elevator you see the monster rush towards you as you quickly try to close the doors so you can get the fuck out of there. And just when you think you're safe, the monster catches up with you in the elevator and you are forced to narrowly make your escape as you chop its hand off with the fallen elevator. When I first played the game, I thought I had actually killed the monster, and I was so shocked to see it again when you face off against it in your final encounter with her. Out of all the encounters with the girl throughout the game, I have to say that her final encounter is my least favorite. While I like the general concept of having to play essentially a game of hide and seek with the girl, the game is simply way too generous with giving you magnum ammo to stun the girl with. That's not even mentioning the conveniently placed work lights right next to each other, which kind of killed the tension every time she would show up, as I would immediately book it to the work light that was a few feet from the lever as I'd turn it on and watch her scurry away as I went back to crank the lever. With the girl's second encounter, it felt like they naturally ramped up the stakes by using the tools they had given us to survive in your first encounter with her, and expanded upon it to make it more exciting. With her final encounter, it felt not only repetitive, but lazy too, as it didn't expand upon the gameplay that was introduced in the previous 2 encounters, and gave me the impression that the game needed to add in one more scary encounter before we play as Leon. While the girls' encounters did have their moments in each section, as a whole, I would say that I wasn't impressed. They each had a lot of potential, but I don't think they were executed well apart from some moments in my second encounter with her. But aside from that, they were some of the weaker parts of Grace's campaign for me. Apart from the girl, the enemy variety in this game is pretty sparse, as 90% of the time you'll only be fighting zombies, but they more than make up for it with how they've programmed the zombies, as each zombie comes up with their own unique set of behaviors and quirks, whether that be the way they've all kept a bit of their living personalities into their now undead ones, or how each of them act, all keeps the game feeling fresh when exploring each area, as you don't know what kind of zombie you'll be encountering next. Their behaviors and designs all make it a nice surprise, whether that be a blind zombie that can only notice you through auditory activities as it rapidly swings its stand around the closer it gets to you. Funnily enough, these zombies can be taken advantage of when other zombies are in a room. Just simply throw a bottle at one of them and the blind zombie will start attacking the other ones. Even if you can't always take advantage of every zombie in a combat scenario, some of them can be quite interesting to observe, like the cleaning maid who will obsessively fixate on cleaning parts of the care center and will sometimes clean up the messes that you've made from your bloody encounters with the other zombies. Although my favorite zombie out of them all would have to be the singers that you encounter in your time at the care center. While there are only 2 that you come across in the care center, the 2 are enough to give you a run for your money if you are unprepared. Their screams can disorient the player, not only making your aim worse, but also lowering your health. The design of her is just as beautiful as it is deeply unsettling, as she is constantly smiling at you when coming in your direction. Even when you aren't in the same room as her, you can hear her singing through the walls as you traverse through the care center. And it does a good job at throwing you off at times, especially when there are enemies nearby. When I was going through the game for the first time before I met her, I was almost convinced she was some kind of apparition that was stuck in the care center until I saw her. In a way, it's almost tragic the way they carry over bits of their personalities from their previous life, as it weirdly humanizes them a lot more, way more than the previous games, as their behaviors extend further into speech. In previous Resident Evil games, most of the zombies attacking you mostly groaned and moaned, as they slowly hobbled their way towards you with the exception of one in Resident Evil 3. Here, many of the zombies are not only capable of doing tasks they were doing before they died, but can also speak somewhat coherently. According to the game's director, Koshi Nakanishi, they recorded over 100 unique lines for the zombies that gave them more of a personality that makes you question whether these zombies are really all gone, or if there is something still human deep down in there, somewhere beneath the infection. It makes you ponder even more when it is later revealed that Elpis is a cure-all for the virus, so you gotta wonder if these poor souls could have been saved, or if they are too far gone. Some of the things that the zombies say as well, like apologizing while they attack you, or yelling "help me" as you brutally put them out of their misery, can make you hesitate or second guess yourself at times, and it really adds a layer to the enemies, rather than them just being something you can soak bullets into. Along the way, you'll also gain access to a game-changing upgrade called the Blood Collector and Blood Specimens. This item plays a massive role in Grace's arsenal, as the blood allows you to craft certain items that will make your time throughout Resident Evil 9 a lot easier. The caveat of this is that blood isn't always handed out to you. A lot of the time, in order to get some blood if you're in a rock and a hard place, is to kill some of the enemies, expanding upon that gameplay mechanic of having to fight your way through in order to get what you need to progress. You can also find the blood specimens scattered around the care center, and when you gather them, they unlock new recipes for Grace to craft with her newly found blood collector. While this isn't the most groundbreaking mechanic ever, as it is your average crafting system taken from the previous Resident Evil titles, I find the way it is executed to have its own cool gameplay loop, as it adds another layer to your inventory management throughout the game. One of the newly added items you can craft is called a hemolytic injector. It is something you can use to fill the body up with a drug that explodes zombies into a pile of blood gloop that stops them from further mutating into something more dangerous. Similar to the Crimson Heads from the Resident Evil 1 remake, if you down a zombie and leave them for too long, they will turn into something called a blister head. Blister heads are more ruthless than your average zombie. They run at you as they swing their limbs uncontrollably, while also having the ability to dodge as they make their way towards you, making their attacks incredibly hard to fend off as you try and dispose of them. Not to mention that they deal a mountain load of damage if you're caught in their crossfire, so the best course of action is to try and dispose of a zombie before they turn. The catch-22 here is that you only have so much blood and resources you can collect to make the injectors, meaning that you'll have to pick your targets carefully. Some of the other items that the game introduces are steroids and stabilizers. These two are used to permanently upgrade your aim and health throughout the game, and seeing that Grace doesn't have a lot of health to begin with, as one attack from an enemy can drop Grace's health to caution, so it's worth using them whenever you can. Stabilizers, on the other hand, are a must, as throughout Grace's portion of the game, you are given a limited amount of ammo, and with that means every shot counts. Stabilizers are able to end fights quicker and with less ammo, as your shots land better, meaning that you'll be able to conserve more of your ammo to use if you ever land yourself in a tight spot. If I were forced to pick which I would say you should prioritize, I would say the stabilizer 100%. On standard difficulty, you're only going to get hit if you mess up, whereas with the stabilizers, you have a better guarantee that your bullets are more effective. It's going to work for you in every enemy encounter, where steroids are purely situational. I'd say they work just as well if you're playing on Insanity difficulty, since making those shots count so you can stagger the enemy and push them aside is far more important. Of course, steroids aren't completely useless, as you can't exactly complain when it comes to more HP. But throughout my 3 playthroughs, I've always found myself picking the stabilizers over the steroids because it offers more benefits. I think my favorite use of the blood mechanic has to be how it ties into the save system if you are playing on the standard difficulty with ink ribbons. The main way to get more of them is by using the blood crafting system. It's quite a genius concept, as the way you can get more saves is by either exploring or fighting, risking your progress the longer you search. Personally, I played pretty cautiously on my first playthrough, and ended up with a bunch of these bad boys by the end, so I wasn't stressed when trying to find more. I am very happy with the mechanic. The way the game utilizes the entire crafting system and ties it into needing to plan out and strategize every encounter is very well done, as it rewards the player with an incredibly fun gameplay loop. Although I will admit, as many others have already pointed out before me, the way the crafting works from a logistical standpoint is extremely goofy. I'm not sure how sucking people's blood like a vampire with our injector equates to 10 handgun bullets. Did the game forget to tell us that Grace can perform blood rituals at will? Even for Resident Evil standards, the idea is a little bit out there. It's a very weird thing to base your crafting system around, but it works, and might be my favorite crafting system in the whole franchise. The mechanic really puts the survival into survival horror. Unfortunately, I cannot say the same thing about the puzzles, as they are very few and far between. There are 4 main puzzles that you can do that are mandatory throughout the game, and they follow the usual Resident Evil puzzle formula of get X item from X place in order to unlock X thing. Another is where you find a note for the organ box that tells you the answer without adding any kind of complexity to it. There's also one puzzle in the security manager's office that I find kind of funny, because Grace is basically handed the answer, but because the buttons are all written in Braille, Grace for some reason can't do the puzzle, despite the fact that when you press one of the buttons, the symbol shows up for them visually, so you could just figure it out through trial and error, but instead we risk getting Emily out of her containment. I'm aware that Resident Evil as a franchise has never had the most complex puzzles, nor are they well known for them. They're usually pretty simplistic in their execution, as they serve as a means to an end of getting an item, rather than challenging you outright. Although I'd say out of them all, the puzzle box in the lead researcher's office was by far my favorite, as the environment played a big role in helping you solve the puzzle, where you'd have to try and figure out the combination by looking at the background photos. I wish that more of the puzzles in RE9 would take advantage of their own environments for this kind of thing, as other Resident Evil titles have done so in the past, but I'm not too fussed on them either way. They aren't offensive enough to be as bad as the puzzles in Resident Evil 8 or the Resident Evil 3 remake, and they aren't as good as the ones in Resident Evil 7 or the RE2 remake. They simply exist, and since the other aspects of Grace's section are so good, I don't mind that the puzzles aren't really anything life-changing. Once you've gathered all 3 quartz cubes, you and Emily move your way to the courtyard, where you encounter Harry, a helicopter pilot who has lost his keys inside the house and tasks you with finding them. Seems easy enough? Making your way inside the house, you have to do a little bit of exploring to solve the Helix puzzle, where you can also find an hourglass that you can detach. The hourglass is part of an Easter egg called the Final Puzzle, and is something optional you can do if you are desperate for some extra points, as the steps you need to follow to ensure the puzzle is completed can be quite overwhelming, but it's a cool thing that the developers put in as a way to give the players something to find. I suppose the only tweak I would add to this puzzle is having the prize for solving it be a little bit more rewarding. It's such a cool optional piece of side content, and the only thing you get for it as points is a little underwhelming. Completing the puzzle will turn the room into a secret elevator, and after some exploring you get the helicopter key. Your troubles only start there though, as the entire underground starts to self-destruct, and you have to make a mad dash out of there before the factory collapses in on itself. This is a really fun section, as you unlock a weapon exclusive to this sequence, where you can spray zombies with the hemolytic spray, causing them all to explode. It's a nice change of pace to gradually ease the player into getting more comfortable with the action-heavy material of the game as we are slowly introduced to Leon's portion. Although, if I were to comment on one thing about Grace's section in the courtyard, I kind of wish that we got a little bit more time with Harry. He had the potential to be a really cool side character. Not to mention the way he dies is kinda dumb, since Grace has a gun and could have shot some of the zombies off the helicopter, but instead kind of aids in the helicopter crashing. But this is a Resident Evil game after all, so the helicopter guy has to die, as is tradition. Seeing how we are nearing the end of everything I wanted to talk about in terms of Grace's part of the story, I'll briefly touch on her character. To me, Grace Ashcroft is a breath of fresh air in the franchise, and if her character had been different in any way, I don't think her sections would have worked nearly as well. I've seen her compared to Ethan Winters, who is being described as the everyman put in a deadly situation, but I honestly disagree with that assessment. Ethan Winters has always been prioritized as someone the player could anchor onto when experiencing the horrors of Resident Evil 7. And that's not a bad thing by any means, but this blank personality was never meant to go beyond anything further than that, which is partially why I think when Capcom tried developing him more for the sequel, they didn't do a great job. But they tried. If I were to pinpoint what makes Grace so different from Ethan, I would say that you are experiencing the horror with her rather than as her, leading to her character coming across as more authentic in her reactions. Her fear is something that I find to be so infectious that it made it all the more enjoyable to play as her. She feels like a regular person who is dropped into a nightmare, and she has to try and find her way out of it. Sure, she's in the FBI, but she's only an analyst, which explains why she isn't all that experienced in the field of combat. The detail when she fires Leon's magnum for the first time and having a reaction to the blowback is kind of endearing in a way, or when she unlocks the door to the parlor and wonders how people usually get into that room. I should preface though that I only like the character of Grace, and that her story is something that I'm not as fond of, but we'll get to that when I talk about the ending. Another character who is introduced in Grace's section is Victor, and as a whole, he's a fun villain who serves as a neat foil to Grace, and easily has some of the best voice acting in the whole game. Unfortunately, he doesn't have a lot of screen presence, and that's partially due to him being sidelined in the second half of the game once Zeno shows up until he dies so he can become the main villain again, which weirdly enough results in Zeno's character being harmed in the process. I'm aware that the point of him is supposed to be that he's a clone of Wesker, but they never explore that in any significant way. He doesn't have the screen presence that Wesker does, and the game doesn't devote any time into explaining what he is. For a good portion of the game, I genuinely thought that Wesker himself had come back from the dead, especially since he is voiced by the same guy who played Wesker. Maybe it's just to set up some future plot points within the franchise, but I still don't understand why that would restrict the developers from exploring him just a little more. Wesker's presence in Resident Evil 5 was a lot of fun, and we could have had that execution done similarly in Resident Evil 9, but instead he's oddly forgettable. After Zeno's introduction, we move over to Leon's section of the game. Before that, while we were playing as Grace, we still occasionally got to switch over to Leon as a fun little change of pace. They usually don't go any longer than 30 minutes, and flow pretty seamlessly with Grace's segments. His first segment does a good job at getting you familiar with the mechanics, which have been mostly retained from the Resident Evil 4 remake. Leon can still parry, roundhouse kick, and stun the enemies by using his gun. The knife that he usually uses has been replaced with an axe, and while there isn't a fundamental difference in gameplay between the two, using the hatchet feels more brutal, as Leon uses stun attacks that can decapitate or greatly incapacitate the enemy. When I first saw Leon's section from the gameplay trailers, my main worry was that his gameplay would feel a bit too samey to RE4's, as it has a very similar style to it. While that assessment is half true, I think that Resident Evil 9 does enough to differentiate itself from 4, that it doesn't feel like the game is copying the homework of its previous installment. Instead, the hatchet does have limited durability, like the knife in Resident Evil 4. Instead of needing to buy a replacement every time you've used all its durability up, you can simply sharpen your axe and get back into the action. At times this can work well with upping the tension, leaving you open to attacks when you've got a group of enemies surrounding you, and you have to now rely on your environment instead. However, I think that this part of the gameplay is actually a downgrade in comparison to how the Resident Evil 4 remake handled it. In that game, the enemies would be constantly charging at you, which incentivized you to use your knife as a means of defense. Throughout Resident Evil 9, there wasn't a time where I felt like I needed to use my parry. If you're smart about how you play the game, not a lot of enemies are going to get close to you, as their movement speed is quite slow. Not to mention the fact that you can simply repair your axe instead of having to buy a new one is a double-edged sword. On one hand, it does work effectively at what it's set out to do, but by making the axe essentially unbreakable, it eviscerates any sort of challenge from Leon's sections that the RE4 remake managed to perfect. But when taking everything else into consideration, this is my only complaint with how Leon's combat mechanics work, and most of the time they function even better than the Resident Evil 4 remake's mechanics. Unlike previous installments where characters stick to their own weapons, Leon can now use his environment to his advantage, as he can throw anything near him at his disposal, whether that be a gas tank you can throw into a crowd of enemies and have it explode on impact, or using an enemy's own weapon against them when you've got them knocked down. This mechanic helps keep the action moving when you've got not much else to work with. Even when you do, it feels so satisfying to throw an axe at the head of a zombie like you're John Wick. The biggest compliment I can give to Leon's gameplay is that it knows how to make you feel like a badass. Leon may be old, but that doesn't mean he's lost his touch. These weapon throws and stun locks can be used for the mini-bosses you face off against as well. But it's not just Leon who can use the gifts of his environment to his advantage. Once you make it to the care center as Leon, you'll come across a zombie chainsaw man. And even when you manage to take him down, other remaining enemies can pick it up if you're not quick enough to collect it for yourself. Enemies armed with melee weapons will at times throw or swing their weapons at you in retaliation. Later on in the game, this gets a little bit more advanced, as some of them are manned with explosives, guns, or armor, which means you'll have to invoke a bit of strategy when taking them down. Leon now also has the ability to perform environmental finishers. These finishers add a bit of flair to the combat, and are quite similar to the hatchet finishers when you stun an enemy. If you've played the game, you may have accidentally performed one of these in the middle of combat. However, there is a way to trigger these finishers on purpose. It may take some practice as you need to get the enemy to a low health status, but once you get the hang of it, you'll be using these finishers left and right. I found that the Requiem is the easiest way to perform one of these, as they typically can one-shot enemies, but from my 3 playthroughs of experience, any upgraded weapon will do the trick. Every encounter with Leon and Grace's section of the game builds upon the previous seamlessly in its progression. When you start the game, you only have your pistol and your Requiem that you will give to Grace only a few minutes later. Resident Evil 9 takes advantage of this opportunity, as it forces you to use each weapon that you acquire in a unique combat encounter. In Leon's third encounter, you acquire the shotgun and are forced to fight Chunk. Chunk is an enemy that you can encounter as Grace and Leon. This is explained in a note that mentions that a pair of brothers were experimented on, and the end result was the pair turning into Chunk. The space where you fight Chunk is incredibly claustrophobic, giving you room to experiment with your newfound shotgun on the beast. Afterward, the game allows you to go through and explore the care center, but this time as Leon. Like Grace, you get plenty of opportunity to explore and attain new items. Things that weren't accessible to Grace previously are now unlockables or new pathways for Leon. It makes backtracking through the care center again as Leon less tedious and more of a fun side activity. This is where the contrast is most clear between Leon and Grace in the game. Coming back to this area as Leon, and easily defeating enemies that you were having trouble with earlier as Grace, is such a surreal but satisfying feeling. Those rules that you were forced to learn with Grace, where you had to adapt and survive, are thrown out the window the second Leon comes into the care center. Even if you've cleared out most of the enemies as Grace, there are still plenty you can fight when you unlock the new area to test your shotgun on. Out of all of Leon's sections in the game, this one was definitely my favorite, as they designed everything perfectly to come full circle with Leon's gameplay. The sniper section where you have to defend Grace from the incoming zombie horde was also quite fun. Usually I'm not a big fan of these types of missions, but I think they managed to find a way to make it enjoyable, and was the perfect way to implement the sniper rifle for the first time, as it isn't something you can simply do with another weapon without making things harder for yourself. It's quite intense, and what makes it even better is how involved it is. You can pre-kill some of the zombies before they wake up later in the section, and use the gas tank to your advantage in the fight. It's not just some boring segment where you have to play one specific way. There's enough variety in it to keep it from feeling too tedious. Playing this section on insane difficulty was a different story entirely, as it changes up the level design where zombies can attack you while you're trying to defend Grace. It's stressful as you not only have to watch Grace's back, but yours too. However, like I said before, you don't have to play by the rules, as you can pre-kill these zombies before you even start the section, so you don't have to worry about them while you're taking care of Grace. It's not exclusive to this section either. Almost every section with Leon and Grace have been tweaked to make the experience feel more raw, to the point where I'd say that playing as Leon on insane difficulty is probably the best way to experience his campaign. It takes all the elements from Leon's regular difficulty and expands upon it in ways that are super interesting. It starts feeling less like Resident Evil 4 and more like how you felt as Grace when you were exploring the care center. With Leon in this difficulty, it feels like your main objective is to survive above anything else. You start to treasure every resource, and you have to become a bit more strategic with how you can tackle certain encounters. Similar to Grace's portion of the game, you feel weak when going up against these enemies. Weapons that gave your enemy a swift death in your standard playthrough may not be as effective when going through the game again on Insanity. Your weapons are weaker and stuns are never guaranteed. Your axe, something that you originally used as a means of flare, the game now has you using it as your only means of survival when an enemy gets too close. Should you use that one grenade now or later? Insanity's difficulty will have you questioning every decision you make, and at times the best decision is to run away to conserve some of that precious ammo you've been building up. Grenades are more useful in Insanity, as they often do more damage and put your enemies in a stunned state that gives you the upper hand. Tempted as you may be to waste your ammo to try and stun a zombie, especially one that is on the upper echelon in terms of strength, it is better to conserve your ammo and use it only when necessary. There's a lot more strategy when it comes to crafting too. Because resources are scarce, you'll have to think about what you'll want to place your bets on when prepping for your next fight. From my experience, investing it all into shotgun shells and rifle ammo was the way to go. The game already gives you enough handgun ammo to a fault, so making more is kinda pointless. You'll need the shotgun and rifle ammo to try and land crits and stuns in order to not prolong a fight more than it needs to be. However, it's not all an uphill battle with insane difficulty, as the game essentially gives you the upgrade station in almost every section of the game, allowing you to get a bit more of an advantage over your enemies, so you aren't completely overwhelmed by its difficulty. Body armor is given a way bigger purpose in Insanity mode, as it serves almost as an extra life in a way. In standard mode, I always found the body armor to be quite useless, as I never felt like I was in any danger of dying as Leon, so giving myself more health almost felt like cheating in a way, as I was way too overpowered wearing it. Sure, there is a catch that you have to replace it every time it breaks, but the cost to replace it is so low that it doesn't even feel like there's a consequence to buying it. With Insanity, it doesn't feel like it's a difficulty where they just ramped up the damage and made you weaker. There was a lot of thought put into this, and moments where I thought I had the game locked down, only for me to find out either the game had switched up the level design, or that I significantly underestimated what the enemies were capable of. There's a level of thoroughness to appreciate, and it helped Leon's campaign flow a lot better when I replayed it. However, with age comes restrictions, and there are certainly a couple. For one, Leon's speed takes a massive hit, as he moves a lot slower in comparison to how he did in Resident Evil 4, and his fighting style is a lot less exaggerated, which means no more suplexing or backflips for Leon anymore. You'd think this type of thing would affect Leon's performance, but after spending many hours fighting through zombie hordes with him, he's still in peak condition. I am a little surprised with how they didn't try to make combat more of a challenge due to his infected state, as it could have been a cool mechanic to try and work through some of those difficulties. Maybe his aim gets a little worse throughout, maybe his health is a little lower than how it was to start off. The only real attempt they make is near the end of the game, when he will occasionally cough and you'll get this weird purple visual pop-up. From what I can tell though, these are all scripted, so if you remember when they appear in his sections of the lab, you can choreograph it decently well more often than not. I should state that the fact that they don't make Leon weaker in the gameplay is not an issue, and more of a missed opportunity I wish they could have experimented with. Fighting enemies as Leon never gets boring, as they are constantly ramping up the stakes and making every situation more intense than the last, encouraging you to constantly go through your arsenal in order to take them down. While you'd think that the switch from Grace's survival horror gameplay to Leon's more action-oriented focus would create a bit of a jarring shift, they handle it quite well, especially when you fully transition to Leon's portion of the game when Grace is captured by Xeno. It's through Leon that the game focuses a lot heavier on the nostalgia in comparison to Grace, which makes a lot of sense as this all started with Leon, and seeing that for Leon's portion, we'll be heading back into Raccoon City, there's bound to be more that ties back to him than Grace, and I think that the game handles it all very tastefully for the most part. I found revisiting Raccoon City to be quite charming, as it was fun at times seeing all the references to Resident Evil 2 ranging from the obvious stuff like the RPD, down to the more subtle details like seeing Leon's old car still stuck at that gas station where he first met Claire. If you got the deluxe edition, you can even get some extra Easter eggs to find, such as a letter from Marvin's daughter. It's all really cool, and the fact that we can now explore the outskirts of Raccoon City and see it for all its glory in modern graphics was something I've wanted for the longest time. And while I would have preferred that we got it with the Resident Evil 3 remake, I guess it's better than nothing. Getting to see all the classic locations that were either in Resident Evil 3 or shown in Resident Evil 2, like revisiting Kendo's gun shop, all felt like a massive treat. And the way they centered the mission around exploring the city to find the detonator parts was a stroke of genius from the developer's side, as you get to take in Raccoon City and explore its environment thoroughly, whilst progressing through the story at the same time, and I think that this is where the game hits its stride the hardest with Leon's campaign. Roaming around the city and getting to explore all its nooks and crannies, not to mention that each section where a detonator part was located in had a fun challenge or gameplay quirk to go along with it. My favorite out of all of them is when you have to track down the final detonator part, and you have to traverse through these tilted buildings to get there. And one of the buildings, the floor was made entirely of glass, and you would be able to shoot the glass underneath the enemy as a way to dispose of them. It was a nice way to add some spice to the combat encounters, and I honestly wish they included more of these little glass floor sections, as it was quite short-lived. Unfortunately, my praise of Leon's section ends once you get all the detonator parts, as it goes downhill quite quickly, at times even dropping to Resident Evil 6's quality, because after that, you are put into my favorite part of any Resident Evil game, really poorly designed vehicle sections. It didn't work in Resident Evil 5 and 6, and it doesn't work here. You're given infinite ammo, so there's no tension or worry of fucking up and running out of ammo. The gameplay is essentially dumbed down to point, shoot, reload, and repeat. It's insulting, as the game treats you like you've never shot a gun before. The flow of the section is constantly killed too by Leon having to stop multiple times throughout the section, needing to look around and shoot the next thing in order to progress. You are given practically zero agency throughout this section, as it's mostly scripted and you don't need to engage with it all that much. At the bare minimum, you have to shoot the occasional mutant dog, but that's about it. Shooting Victor doesn't make the slightest difference, as the only shot that matters is the one where you shoot the gas tank before a cutscene plays. Sure, you can shoot him whenever he's about to attack you, but his attacks hardly do a whole lot of damage to you, so you can kinda just ignore him and you'll be fine. I think this hatred for the vehicle section comes a bit from false expectations. As I saw the motorbike when I first unlocked the BSAA container, I assumed that we would have more agency riding around on it. I mean, sure, you can control the direction the bike goes in during the section, but it's a very optional thing, as you don't have to touch the controls at all and the bike will automatically ride itself. I've seen a lot of people complain about this section because of how ridiculous and cartoony it is in comparison to what the game's tone was beforehand. But I honestly don't have a problem with it. I've seen dumber shit occur in previous Resident Evil titles, and I'm all for engaging in a bit of dumb fun. But the issue with this section is not that it's goofy, it's that from a gameplay perspective, it is terribly designed. Although out of all things to adapt into your game, I respect that they decide to adapt the iconic scene of Leon fighting off a pack of zombie dogs from the hit animated movie Resident Evil Vendetta. Afterwards, we finally arrive at what the game has been hyping up for almost the entirety of its runtime, the RPD. I mentioned earlier that whether they would get this right or horrifically butcher it was a 50-50 split. I like the idea of Leon being forced to face his demons head-on after all these years. It is the incident that stuck with him the most, and the fact that the game gives us the opportunity to come back and potentially explore some of those ideas is a great concept. However, having played through the RPD section of the game, I'm sad to report that it was worse than I could have imagined. Throughout this whole game, they hype up the internal conflict with Leon revisiting the RPD, and what do they do with it? They show some flashbacks to the previous games and have Leon looking a little distressed. I'm not kidding, that is all the time they decide to dedicate to that conflict that they have set up for the entire game, or if you want to get even more technical, ever since Resident Evil 4. Yet Leon addresses it for a minute, tells Sherry that he's in the RPD, Sherry tells him that it's been a while, and Leon just agrees. Yes, I know that Leon is being affected by this on the inside, but if you're going to hype up the return of the RPD, the least you could do is give us a bit of character development with Leon. There are a couple moments in the RPD section that explore Leon's trauma in neat ways, but they are all pieces of an incomplete whole. Sure, lines like,
"Rest easy, officer."
and
"Hey, Lieutenant Brenna. Kennedy. Reporting for duty."
are great moments in a capsule, but if they are the only bit of exploration through Leon's trauma you are going to give us, then it is not enough. What's even more infuriating is that you aren't even in the RPD for very long before the game kicks you out and forces you to move on to the next section. I tracked the amount of time I spent playing through the RPD section casually, and it took me a solid 12 minutes total. That is an insultingly small amount of time to revisit not only one of the most iconic locations in the franchise, but a place that personally impacted Leon a great deal. Before, I found the nostalgia to be quite endearing, as you walked through the ruins of Raccoon City, but this was the one time where I felt like I was being pandered to. Don't even get me started on the return of Mr. X either, as if the short RPD section wasn't insulting enough. They decide to bring back Mr. X. I will admit, if done tastefully, this would have been fine, maybe a little desperate, but relatively harmless overall. But instead, the game forces you into a scripted chase scene with him until you fight him outside of the RPD. I touched on this in my Resident Evil Ranked video, but the reason why I liked Mr. X so much in the Resident Evil 2 remake was that so many of his encounters felt natural. There was a presence to him that made you feel a little bit more paranoid before you entered into a room while you explored the RPD. There is none of that here. He's not explored in any creative way throughout the gameplay. He's reduced to a scripted chase scene and a lousy boss fight. The boss fight itself isn't exactly bad in a vacuum, but considering how this fight is based around Leon's history, I was sorely disappointed with how they went about it. The backdrop you fight in is pretty bland, and Mr. X's moveset consists of either running at you, jumping on cars, or throwing cars at you. Rinse and repeat till you've shot the big obvious weak spot enough, and he'll die after a couple minutes. It's pretty unfulfilling, and yeah, the scripted chase wasn't amazing, but I think the fact that Mr. X's showdown with Leon for the first time in decades was executed in such a boring way was the biggest slap in the face aside from the handling of the subject matter of the RPD itself. However, I would be lying if I said that there was nothing of value that came from this section, because there were a couple things I appreciated about it, even if there weren't many. For one, I like how they used a remix of the original theme for when Leon enters into the RPD. It's utilized perfectly, but in a way that feels like you're revisiting an old memory come to life. The other thing I liked was the little Easter egg puzzle that the game had you do to find Albert Wesker's gooning material. The first time I stumbled upon it, it was quite funny, and the little scavenger hunt the game gets you to do to find it was quite charming, as it utilized the environment of the RPD fairly well. I wish that they did more stuff like this with the RPD, but I guess I'll take what I can get. Other than that, revisiting the RPD shockingly had a lacking amount of substance to it. Instead of being used for some fun gameplay and neat characterization, it feels like it's treated like any other gameplay section where you walk around until the next bit of story happens. It's disappointing, and I'm surprised that they managed to do so little with this section, despite how ripe it was for some cool gameplay and story moments. And that's not even mentioning the terrible Orphanage section that was stitched in between the exploration of the RPD as Leon. It was, without a doubt, the worst part of the game, as the entire gameplay loop is essentially bogged down to sitting in a corner, waiting for 2 minutes, only for you to go to another place just to sit in another corner for a couple more minutes. There is nothing challenging, nothing that engages the player at all, to the point that when I was streaming my Insanity run of Resident Evil 9, I decided to leave my computer to go to the bathroom to see which would take longer to do, and when I came back, I still had to remain hidden for another 30 seconds. I dub it the Resident Evil Piss Challenge, and if you're able to, I challenge all of you out there to give it a shot, as it's a good way to pass the time while playing this miserable section. What's disappointing is that the character designs for the children are quite creepy, and there are some things that the children did during the section that I thought added a cool horror factor to them, like how one child just jumps off the second floor and hits their head on the ground, only to get back up again. That stuff is neat in concept, but seeing how the gameplay is reduced to sitting in a single spot for minutes on end, the creepiness factor never reaches its fullest potential. Similar to the opening segment of Grace's gameplay at the very beginning of the game, this game takes a lot of time to reach a point that could have been communicated in an easier way. The twist is that we are playing as Grace's clone, and that she is being cloned because she is special. This was something that we could have been told through dialogue while Zeno was monologuing to Leon. It's not like the twist would have been less effective, as it would have had roughly the same impact, except I'd be less annoyed. I wouldn't say that the entire second half of Leon's campaign is all bad though, as things get a little better once you encounter the Plant 43 seedlings. They aren't all that impressive, as they serve as pretty basic placeholder enemies and nothing more. Although I am a little disappointed by them, because if you compare the Plant 43 enemies in Resident Evil 9 to how they are in the Resident Evil 2 remake, the difference is night and day. Not a problem per se, but I wish they had a little more going for them than just requiring you to shoot the big obvious weak points in order to defeat them. Luckily, they disappear completely once you reach the lab, so it's not like you have to deal with them for long. I'm still a little disappointed that they didn't do more with them. Once you reach the lab, the game takes a weird tonal shift by introducing these enemy soldiers that you are required to fight off, and it feels like I'm playing Call of Duty. From a design perspective, these enemies are quite decent. Their pathfinding is good as they act like a tactical team, and I can't lie when I say that these guys managed to knock me around a fair bit. They do a lot of damage to Leon, and if you're not careful, you'll find your health bar getting sliced in half if you sit out in the open for too long. This is not like any other enemy where you can just simply parry their attacks or keep your distance. You have to strategize and use whatever piece of the environment you can as cover. In your second encounter with them, you can even release a liquor as a way to take them out, with the caveat that you'll have to take care of it once it's finished with the soldiers. And that's the kind of environmental design that I like, actively rewarding the player for being creative when trying to explore a different path when taking down the enemy. We also get this cool little mini-boss with Hunk. Well, sort of Hunk, but not really. I've heard some people say that it's Hunk and others say that it was someone who was trained by him. At this point, it's whatever the future Resident Evil games deem it to be, which is probably why we don't get proper confirmation. I like how this fight isn't some glorified QTE button mash. The game decides to test your parry skills using the Hunk fight as a vessel for that. The game has quite a bit of tension to it. You can't just go in and spam axe combos on him. You have to be patient and at times let him make the first move. And just when you'll start to get the hang of it, the game will switch things up and have him throw a flashbang or use some stealth tactics in order to try and get the upper hand. On Insanity difficulty, it is even more intense, as you do less damage to him, and trying to block his attacks are more difficult. To me, Insanity mode is the true test of whether you have mastered the parry system in the game. The fight isn't anything mind-blowing, but I like it for what it is, and it switches things up to keep the gameplay from becoming too monotonous. Although I have a couple issues with how they executed it. For one, like many things in this game, this encounter would have benefited from some setup from a gameplay and narrative perspective, especially since Hunk as a character doesn't have a lot of substance to him, so when he appears here it feels a little random and out of left field. This fight could have also been improved a little more if the room was a bit more open. Because of how cramped the environment is, whenever he would try to scurry away, it was always pretty easy to catch up to him and take him by surprise. They're all relatively minor issues, but I thought I'd touch upon them briefly, as they did bug me a little. After you defeat Hunk, you finally assume control back to Grace, as you need to find a way to clear a path for Leon, and try to find a way back up to stop Elpis. I don't have too much to say about this section as a whole, seeing as it's pretty similar to the other Grace sections. We get introduced to two enemy types that Grace and Leon have to deal with throughout their laboratory sections, the Lickers and the Arc Zombies. While it is possible to encounter the Lickers before you play as Grace, they are missable, so I'm going to count them as being an official introduction here. We play as Grace, having hardly anything to defend ourselves with, other than a gun with no ammo, and some glass bottles. It's during this section that the game introduces a new weapon, the bottle acid that is used to, in theory, insta-kill lickers, or at least cause a lethal amount of damage to them. While I do appreciate that they're trying to keep the stealth survival horror gameplay going, I would have preferred if the game had given us a bit more for us to defend ourselves with at this point in the game. Grace is more competent than she was at the start of the game, and it would have been neat to show that evolution through the gameplay. Of course, I'm not asking for Grace to become Leon Kennedy, where she bashes zombies' skulls in and parries liquor tongues with her hatchet, but I'm saying that she should at least get a weapon that puts her a bit more on the offensive to even the odds a little. What we get is fine, but I think doing that would have solidified her arc a little more for me. Instead, the gameplay is a bit more of the same, where you have to fetch a couple of orbs to unlock a door. It's a good section, and it doesn't overstay its welcome. While it's recommended that you stealth through this part on a first playthrough, you can just run through without much consequence on subsequent playthroughs and you'll be fine. The liquor and zombie combo does make for a bit of a change of pace, as you have less maneuverability. In previous sections when you played as Grace, while stealth was recommended, it was never mandatory, as if you had the ammo and knew what you were doing, you could go in guns blazing and wing it from there. Fighting back is risky, although there is a high reward for it. In the zone where you get the second orb, there are a number of containers that have lots of goodies inside. The problem is that it is guarded by a load of lickers and zombies, which leaves you with an ultimatum on whether it would be worth the bullets and health that you'll lose trying to get them. It's a cool optional bit of side content for the people who want a bit more of a challenge. Once you get both of the orbs, you manage to unlock a room that plays a video of Grace's mother with Oswell Spencer. But before they reveal anything, we switch back to Leon, where he shares the same objective as Grace. The gameplay loop is even essentially the same as Grace's, except with more of an emphasis on the action. You have to retrieve an item, except instead of the item unlocking a door, it now unlocks an elevator. The elevator takes a while to get to Leon, so in the meantime you blast some enemies and kick their heads in. Once the elevator arrives, we try to make our way back to Xeno, but the virus has already spread too much, and we pass out next to the door. If I were to nitpick a little bit, I would say once we leave the elevator, and the game forces us to control an infected Leon fighting for his life, is a bit unnecessary and should have been communicated to us via a cutscene. It just goes on for a tad too long, and we would have gone the point either way. When we cut back to Grace, we get the reveal that Grace was actually never Alyssa's child, but Oswell's, and that Elpis is not actually a weapon, but an antiviral that can cure any infection. This sparks quite a few issues, Oswell's off-screen change of heart being one of them. The last time we see Oswell was in Resident Evil 5, and he was probably one of the most despicable motherfuckers in the whole franchise, and died remaining that way. But all of a sudden in this game he has regrets, and made a cure-all for the violence and mayhem he created throughout the franchise. Just to remind you, this is the same guy who experimented with Jessica and Lisa Trevor and orchestrated the deaths of many people in Raccoon City. This guy is as evil as they come, and all of a sudden you're telling me he had a change of heart before immediately becoming evil again in Resident Evil 5? Personally, my best guess is that he went senile after having that conversation with Alyssa in Resident Evil 9, and reverted back to being evil and forgot he had those moments of regret to begin with. Even then, it feels like it's all a little lazy, but that's not even the biggest complaint I have with the scene, as all of this is set up for the ending. To rewind a little before Grace sees the tape with her mother on it, we make a promise to Leon that we will destroy Elpis no matter what. This is another piece of setup that leads to a multi-choice ending where you can choose to either destroy Elpis or activate it. I hate this ending for a number of reasons. For one, the setup for it is terrible. Instead of using the "You Are My Hope" as a broader theme for the narrative, or using it as setup from the start of the game when we first see Alyssa, we don't get any mention of it until we reach the end of the game, where Spencer magically grows a conscience and decides to do some good for a change. Not to mention that it is way too obvious which is the good ending and which is the bad one, although I can get why some people would be confused about it. Destroying Elpis is the player doing what Leon actually tells us to do, while releasing it is trusting that Spencer had a decent heart in the end, and did actually follow through on his word. It is very much a retread of the choice that is given to you near the end of Resident Evil 7, where you can either save Mia or Zoe. At the end of the day, only one choice matters, except somehow Resident Evil 9 made it 10 times worse, as they make it even more apparent what the bad ending is, as it ends with Leon's face getting blown off. I'm not exactly sure why they even gave us the choice to begin with, as it feels incredibly arbitrary that the game even tells you at the end that if you got the bad ending, you should go back and choose a different option. At that point, just don't bother with the multiple endings gimmick and give us the one ending. I had a friend of mine tell me that they thought when first playing through the game was that they'd do a switcheroo, that the good ending would get Leon killed and the bad ending would save Leon. And in retrospect, I agree. Not only does this fit narratively, but it would also wrap up his story as neatly as you could, as his story has come full circle at this point. Not to mention that it would be a lot more interesting than what we ended up getting, which is basically what I predicted it would be in my Resident Evil ranking video. I honestly wouldn't be surprised if RE9 ended with Leon Kennedy riding off into the sunset with a couple of the side characters at his side. I can actually picture it in my head now, and I will be shocked if the game does not end that way. Safe to say I was basically right. Grace leaves on a helicopter and Leon mostly left in his car. Although I understand why Capcom wouldn't do this, Leon is their premier character. He is the character that sells the most games, and if you don't believe me, then just take a look at the sales for Resident Evil and tell me which games you see appearing at the top spot. While they were implying that this could be Leon's last adventure from all the marketing, I don't think anyone actually bought that anything would happen to him. There's not a whole lot to say about the bad ending other than how much they don't even try to disguise it as a different ending. It is very clearly meant to be an ending that makes you angry so you play the other one. I would have preferred if they made it more convincing, and if people are still unsatisfied with the ending, you can let them attempt the other one. But all of it is done so deliberately to spark outrage so that the player would be prompted to try the other one, and I feel like if they did want to commit to the multiple endings route, the least they could have done was to make it a little bit more convincing. The good ending is about as cookie cutter as you can get for the series. Elpis turns out to be a cure-all, so both Leon and Zeno use it to cure themselves. Not sure why Zeno is trying to cure himself now, even though he could simply wait until he's out of the facility. Leon still wants to kill him, and the laboratory is surrounded with monsters. It feels like the only reason they had Zeno make that decision was so Victor could kill him to regain the spotlight again, which I just find to be a weird decision. He starts off seemingly as the main villain, then you relegate him to nothing more than a side character for half the game, only for him to come back as the main villain again at the end. It just makes Zeno feel less important and disposable, which is something you don't want for someone who is basically Wesker reincarnated. Leading us to the final boss fight with Victor. Out of all the boss fights in this game, Victor's is by far the most underwhelming. It's basically the same thing they did with the Nemesis fight in the Resident Evil 3 remake. It's a big wall of flesh where you have to dodge the occasional incoming attack and shoot the very obvious highlighted weak points. I wish that they were at least a little more creative with the fight is all. Not to mention that despite Grace being a huge part of the game, she has no part in taking down the final boss, which I find to be quite a big missed opportunity. It doesn't have to be something that gets her extremely involved, as it could be something like Leon gets stuck underneath a bit of machinery, and you have to play as Grace to turn the machinery off. Just a working idea, but I'm not kidding when I say that it could be anything. Just let her do something. I think not giving Zeno a final boss either is a little disappointing. Sure, he managed to cure himself, but it's not like they couldn't have done anything interesting with it. Almost immediately after he manages to cure himself from Ligma, he dies by Victor. It doesn't even have to be this big epic boss, but again, I wish he was more involved. Especially with how much the game was hyping him up from the reveal. The dude was aura farming and everything, only for all that to be thrown away when he dies to one of Victor's tentacles. Honestly, you could throw away Zeno's character out the window, and instead committed to making Victor the big bad and nothing would have changed. Although it seems like they were trying to use Zeno as a vessel to communicate that there will be more Wesker clones in future, which if that was meant to be the case, they could have just cut to something at the end of the game that hints at his return, rather than turning Zeno into some evil villain stripped of any agency in the narrative. Aside from my core issues with how we get to the ending itself is fine. Leon is called to a mission by Chris Redfield, and Grace's story concludes with her adopting Emily. It's sweet, but not all that satisfying. While it seems like I hate the ending, I couldn't care for it either way. The weakest part of a Resident Evil game is more often than not the ending, and that couldn't have been more true for this game. But before I conclude my video, I have a few miscellaneous criticisms that I would like to quickly get out of the way, as I wasn't able to find a way to implement them into the video naturally. So I've decided to save them all for the end of the review. I've spoken previously about the importance of music within a Resident Evil game, and to say that Resident Evil 9's soundtrack is lacking would be an understatement. There was never one track that stuck with me, it was all pretty forgettable at the end of the day, and that goes double for the save room theme. Well, if you're even able to hear it. For some reason, they decided to make the save room theme nearly impossible to hear if you weren't trying to listen to it. It's not an issue that affects the game majorly, but as someone who can appreciate a good soundtrack when I hear it, I was sorely disappointed when I was playing through the game. It's not bad or anything, just simply forgettable. This other one is slightly nitpicky and more of a personal issue, but I'm not a fan that they removed the grading system for your runs at the end of the game. Sure, they were arbitrary, but I always enjoyed seeing what grade I got by the end of the game, to see if I could beat my score. Whether that was by saving less or getting a better time, it's a small thing, but it went a long way for me. The only thing that the results page tells you now is what your overall time is. What's annoying is that this is the only place where you can check your time. Yeah, there's also the challenges section, but that disappears once you've completed the achievement for completing the game in less than 4 hours. I would have liked to see something similar to the Resident Evil 2 Remake's pause menu, where it tells you your overall time on the top right. Instead, tracking your time on subsequent playthroughs becomes a bit of a chore, as you're the one who has to do all the work to try and track it. These are all minor complaints, and I'm only mentioning them because they bugged me specifically. Overall, I would say that Resident Evil 9 was a more than welcome surprise. Despite my skepticism from the trailers, I'm happy to report that this game has a lot going for it. The section where you play as Grace in the care center may genuinely be one of the best sections in any Resident Evil game. And Leon's campaign, while a lot of fun, did have some hiccups along the way, but it all manages to come together to deliver an incredibly fun experience. I've been a fan of the series for a long time now, and while I may not have been there since the beginning, I've loved seeing this franchise not only thrive, but ending up becoming more popular than it ever has been. It makes me happy. I'm so glad that for the 30th anniversary, we get a game that simultaneously goes back to its roots, while also including its modernized gameplay into the mix. It feels like the game that Resident Evil 6 was trying to be all those years ago, but didn't have the confidence or direction among many other things to make it work. So, as a fan of the series, I'm happy that we get a game this good for its 30th anniversary. If you're on the fence about whether you should get this game, I'd say that it is well worth your time. There's a lot to get out of it, and while it's not perfect, I'd say that its quality remains relatively consistent throughout, for the most part. With that all being said, I'm going to put Resident Evil 9 in B tier. I'd say it's around the same quality as Resident Evil 7, although I do prefer Resident Evil 7 just a tiny bit more, as I like how the horror aspect is done a little more in that game. Thank you all for watching. It was a lot of fun making this video. Getting to play and review a Resident Evil game is always a treat for me. So if you enjoyed the video as much as I had fun making it, apparently the Resident Evil movie is supposed to be releasing this year, so this might not be the last piece of Resident Evil content you'll be seeing on the channel, as I plan to cover all the movies before the Zack Krager movie comes out. So be on the lookout for that if you enjoyed hearing me rant about these games. Thank you all again for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video, which should hopefully be out soon. Take care, y'all. Bye.